Okay, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons, ready to bring you another great conversation. You know, today, like many days recently, we're continuing to talk about the direction of American politics, particularly electoral politics as we head towards the midterms. And this continued conversation, this continued split in the Democratic Party between, I guess, what you would call the Bernie Sanders DSA wing, a Democratic Socialist of America, the wing of the Democratic Party, or the wing of the left that wants to bring the Democratic Party back to where it's been in the past, specifically to addressing the needs of working class people rather than the needs of Wall Street. So that split is, I guess, between like the Bernie Sanders people, the Bernie bros, versus the Hillary Clinton people, or the Bill Clinton people, or the third way people, the neoliberal motherfuckers who took the Democratic Party and made it the party of Wall Street over the course of the last several decades. So, you know, the fate of the Democratic Party is a big question, I think, for the left. And it's maybe a bigger question is whether the Democratic Party should even be anything we're aiming at. You know, I'm not a big fan of the Democrats. I studied the Vietnam War. That's where I come from as a historian. So the Democrats, you know, play a pretty fucking shameful role in that. But they also, you know, have always been, and I would say, you know, this goes all the way back to the 19th century if you know your history. And we get into this a little in today's show. But the Democratic Party has always been the party that absorbs the radical energy of the left, completely takes the strength from it, steals its thunder, and then eliminates those kinds of policies as they cozy up towards big business. So that pattern has been something that's happened again and again. I mean, we've watched it again and again. And we've also seen candidates like Obama say, this time it's different. And Ocasio-Cortez in New York say, this time it's different. And you can count me as a skeptic whenever we're dealing with the Democratic Party, because I feel like candidates that even as they come from maybe places like the Democratic Socialist of America or coming from radical traditions, as they head into the Democratic Party, they get their power destroyed and they get surrounded and triangulated, etc., etc. So that's, you know, my cynical point of view on the Democratic Party. But, you know, I know there are other views, and I know that we're in a moment right now where it feels like we got to do something. And I also feel like, you know, we've had lots of guests on the show with lots of different attitudes towards this question. You know, do we put our energy towards the Democrats or not? Do we build our own institutions? I mean, my guest today is someone who I think is more on the side of, yes, we use the Democratic Party. Of course we use the Democratic Party. We take it over and we make it do the things we want it to do. And we fashion it back into the party of the working class that it purportedly once was, or at least certainly once more was during the middle of the 20th century. So my guest today is Micah Uetricht. He is managing editor at Jacobin Magazine, one of several different Jacobinites we've had on the show, and I think they're important to talk to. He's not a DSA representative. He makes it clear that he's not speaking for the DSA. But at the same time, I think he understands that perspective, and I think he articulates it well, kind of what the big plan is. What are we trying to do? What is Ocasio-Cortez? You know, what is the end game? Because as I've said on Twitter and I've said other places, my cynicism about this stuff is pretty strong. At the same time, I really get a charge when she's winning, and I really get a charge seeing her on The View talking about socialism and all that stuff. It's really invigorating, and I'm not the kind of person that's arrogant enough to say that I know where things are going. I don't. Maybe socialists will take over the Democratic Party and we'll build a utopia and we'll destroy the right. You know, that's a nice plan. But I also think electoral politics can be, you know, really problematic and troubling and challenging. And slow. And I think that's the main thing for me, is I feel like we're in the 0 hour when it comes to a lot of different issues, specifically climate change, and we need radical solutions very quickly. And that's something that needs to happen on the ground. And I think it is happening on the ground, but how that connects to electoral politics is a big question. So Micah, you know, he's awesome, and he's written a lot of cool stuff about kind of the direction of working class politics in particular. And I trust him because he's Midwestern, he's from Chicago, and I feel like, you know, being in Brooklyn for so many years, and I'm not in Brooklyn anymore, I'm in Southern California, another bubble, but being in those like kind of coastal bubbles really distorts your kind of vision of politics. So hearing from the Chicago folks, hearing from the Midwest folks, particularly about working class politics, is always really important. And I was glad to hear Micah's voice in this. He's also the author of a really great book that everyone should check out called Strike for America, Chicago Teachers Against Austerity, which I think kind of gets to, you know, what Micah's general, the general thrust of his politics is, which is about, again, kind of using the Democratic Party as a machine to achieve what the working class needs and hasn't had for a long time. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. There's a lot more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. If you like this stuff, please consider subscribing to the show. We don't have a lot of money. We're barely making it here. Both Peter and I work full-time jobs, and we're trying to put this show out every week and get it up on thebaffler.com. So go to thebaffler.com and check out the show. Lots of new episodes on there. The Baffler is awesome, and we'll have lots more Baffler stuff, I think, coming on the way. But either way, if you want to support the show, go to nostalgiatrap.com. You can sign up for a Patreon, and the Patreon is basically just a way for you to give a couple bucks to us each month, and we will give you bonus episodes and access to other material to make it worth your while. But we're not selling anything on the show. We're really just trying to get these points of view out there, and if you can help us do that in any way, that would be cool. So go to nostalgiatrap.com, and they can tell you how to become a member of the Nostalgia Trap Club and keep this whole project going. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This is really about kind of getting in between these fights on the left and figuring out exactly where we're going and what the Democratic Party has to do with any of it. So again, enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with the managing editor of Jacobin Magazine and a great writer and a great comrade, Micah Uetricht. Just a couple days ago, I talked to Alex Press, who I know you work with at Jacobin, and it must be a weird moment to see all this stuff happening that Jacobin and other people on the left have been talking about forever coming into the mainstream.
Yeah, it's totally bizarre. Like, my coworker, Sean Goody, can attest that for the last week, I've basically just been like pounding my desk and just like gesticulating at the computer, being like, look at this thing. How is this thing happening? Because like every day it's like, socialism is being discussed by Joy Behar on The View, or Stephen Colbert is telling millions of people on his show that God is a socialist. It's a very bizarre, or even other stuff like Politico is doing like horse race coverage on the New York City DSA's endorsement or non-endorsement of Cynthia Nixon. Like, it's a very bizarre thing. I think I just thought that I would spend my life sort of toiling in defense of ideas that I thought were correct, but would never really have a kind of mainstream resonance, that they would never really catch on in a mainstream way. And I think Bernie's campaign, one of the most important things to take from Bernie's campaign is that basic point that that's not true, that like a lot of the most basic ideas that we are fighting for and are putting out into the world actually do have huge mainstream resonance.
You know what's weird is, so I teach this class for the first time because I'm in California. I had to I moved recently across the whole country, and I had to restart my teaching career. So I'm teaching this class at a local university that's a lifelong learning institute. So everyone there is over 70 or 75 years old. And so I taught a class on the Great Depression and New Deal, and I fully expected to be confronted by all these people who said the ideas of FDR and everything were communist ideas, and thank God we don't do that anymore. But the consensus in the class was why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing stuff like that? Which is which is pretty crazy. I mean, I think that a lot of people are sick of that kind of model, that kind of left model, whatever it might be, even just basic liberalism being trashed.
Right. I mean, obviously there's no other way that we could have a President Trump if that, wasn't the case, that people are just totally disgusted with that model, with the bankruptcy of this kind of tepid liberalism. And, here we are at a time when you can talk to people on the street, or, I go out to restaurants or cafes and I just hear random people talking about socialism around me. And I'm like, in a couple of years ago, if you were talking about socialism somewhere in public, the chances were pretty good, at least in the city that I lived in, that I knew you. And now it's just everybody is talking about it. It's totally wild. And I think that people on the left need to sort of readjust to that reality. We need to realize that we have an incredible opportunity here, but also that it's it could be a fleeting one. We need to take advantage of this as much as we can and grab as many of those people as possible to do, whatever, to get them to join socialist groups, get involved in a socialist campaign, or get involved in a campaign around something like Medicare for All. Push as far as we can on our ideas right now, because historically these things have also happened in the past, but then that window eventually shuts. So we need to just go all in at this moment, because who knows how long it's going to last.
Yeah, we need to grab like all that like disparate energy. I feel like, like things like the Women's March, and I talked about this with Alex, like the things like the Women's March and like even like the March for Our Lives, the like kids with the guns and stuff like that. They're like, there's so much energy, and there's so much energy in a kind of general left way, but it's not really directed to any particular set of policies or institutions. It seems like a really ripe moment for the left to like be that thing and like create policies and institutions that last, because these moments, you're right, they're fleeting, and that's what scares me about this moment.
Right. I mean, and without the left, these moments are not going to, like, they will be fleeting. The enormous amount of energy and excitement that we're seeing around these kind of ideas will dissipate if we don't, have the left making the moves to really consolidate them and, direct them in the right way. I mean, what the whole, recent history shows this really well, right? Like something like, the upsurge of Occupy or other things. Like without a real sort of coherent and purposeful left to consolidate that energy, it can just dissipate into nothingness, and all of that potential can be kind of squandered.
Well, and it's also like the Democratic Party has its fangs out, right? Like they're like,
yeah.
And it's really weird because it's like obviously some of the like mainstream party members are sensing this like populist direction, and trying like to carefully contain it, I imagine. But like, like Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand are saying like really radical things all of a sudden. They have like abolish ICE t-shirts on and stuff, and it's just really, is that something that concerns you, that like the Democratic Party relating to it, how whatever the left is, like the left I see as this kind of this amorphous blob of ideas, but like how do we prevent that? How do we prevent like that, the Democratic Party basically just stealing our line just to win elections and then watering it down?
Well, I think there are individual examples of what you're talking about things being watered down, but on the whole, the party is still mobilizing to try to totally shut down, the Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, the Bernie Sanders of the world, like to the point where I'm like, okay, if I were a Democratic Party strategist, I would be saying, we need to be trying to absorb a little more of this energy. Like, guys, it wouldn't take very much to try to tamp some of this down. Just toss them a couple bones. But for the most part, they're not tossing anybody any bones here. So of course that is a real danger. But to me, seeing what is possible from a campaign like an Ocasio-Cortez campaign, despite, all of these, there are real missteps that she has had, but, even despite that, like the trade-off to getting, to Stephen Colbert saying God is a socialist on late night TV is one that's worth it. But the left does need to be able to, like I said before, figure out what to do with all that energy and not let the energy squander, and not let Chuck Schumer, grab hold of it if he ever does decide that that's something he wants to do.
Well, it's weird because I think I could be wrong, but I think it was Gillibrand that said something like, we got to get to I got to get to the point where, and we all should get to the point of taking no corporate money. And I was like, that's pretty crazy that someone like that would say that, because I'm kind of like, well, where is your power then? That must make the Democratic Party machine people, like the party managers, like absolutely shit themselves, because it's like that's where their power lies. And so I don't know. It's to me, I'm like, I don't know where that goes, because how do you have power without corporate money?
Well, I think that what will happen is either you'll hit a wall where the Democratic Party power brokers will not allow that to happen, given what the nature of what the Democratic Party is, and then people will have to figure out what else that they're going to do with their political energy, right? Or the Democratic Party becomes a workers' party that doesn't take over money. Like, those are the two options at this point, and I don't believe that the latter is going to happen. But for now, I feel like
it's kind of, that's kind of the goal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I mean. We could go into like the theory behind all this, but I feel like that's like kind of where the left fights the most about, like, what's the end game here? What's the practical end game here? But I mean, I feel like one of the conversations that's happening on the left right now is like, there's this, rising group of voices who are like criticizing Ocasio-Cortez and criticizing the DSA or whatever, like Democratic democratic socialism is, to say like, well, it's just New Deal liberalism. Like that's all that it is. I mean, how do you respond to that? Is the DSA like suggesting New Deal liberalism? And if so, like, why is that a bad thing?
Yeah, I can answer that question. I would say first that I am just a rank and file member of DSA. I'm not in a leadership position or anything. But I do, there's been this confusion, especially if you read any of the mainstream coverage of this new thing called democratic socialism, and there are people who are saying, well, it seems like what these people are fighting for is just New Deal liberalism, or they don't usually use the word social democracy, but that's what they're implying.
Right.
These are just people who want some checks on the capitalist system, the worst of the capitalist system, and that's it. Who knows whether that's what the majority of people who are in DSA want, but I think that certainly there is a very large number of people who recognize that capitalism can't be, if you fight for these social democratic reforms, like capital will, as soon as it can, do everything that it can to destroy those kind of checks on itself.
Right.
So, in order to win a decent life for people, you can't stop at those demands, but those demands can be used in such a way to build power, build grassroots movements, build the labor movement, just build this common sense among people that the market is not good at providing for people's basic needs, and that common sense and those movements can be used to fight for much more, beyond those kind of social democratic gains. I mean, this is what people refer to as the non-reformist reforms,
right?
Revolutionary reforms, right? Like fighting for reforms that take us beyond capitalism. And I think even if it's in a kind of incoherent sense, this is what people in the DSA are fighting for. They know that that we need something right now, like yesterday, to fix the worst of this system. They couldn't exactly point to what else would be needed beyond it, and few of us can point what exactly that system should look beyond it. But they do think that there is something in the capitalist system itself that requires more than just a couple reforms, and I think that's a good thing that general sense is spreading among the population.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think I am counted among the many people who were like totally shocked by Ocasio-Cortez's victory, and like, it's one of those makes you think moments where you're kind of like, what does that exactly mean? Because to me, like, I mean, part of me, there's a cynical part of me that's like, well, even if we got like 100 DSA supported candidates in Congress, we would basically be France. Like we would have like, a socialist contingent within our legal structure. But the other part of me is like, we're not France, because, in the United States, socialism has a very particular history. And that's why it's kind of stunning to see this happening right now.
Yeah, it's great. Let's go. We don't
have that history. So you're in one of the things that I think is funny about your Twitter bio is it just says Midwestern, like that's it, like that's such a, and to me, like that's a descriptor, and that like means a certain kind of I don't know. There are certain things that come up in my head when you say Midwestern, especially when I know that you're like a radical or you're on the left. But like, what do you mean by that when you say you're Midwestern? What part of your identity is Midwestern?
The whole thing, I would say.
Yeah.
But, I with the exception of this year that I just lived in Canada up until a month and a half ago, I have never lived outside of the Midwest. So it's literally true that I've spent my whole life in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. I was born in Ohio, and then spent half my childhood in Ohio, half in Michigan. And then I've lived in Chicago for about the past 10 or 11 years. And so, it is literally true, but it's also sort of who I am at the kind of bone deep level. It's a very funny mixture of, my identity as a Midwesterner and my identity as a socialist, right? Because socialism is the whole foundation of socialism is like class conflict, right?
Yeah.
But then being a Midwesterner is all about avoiding conflict.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
That,
like, I was like, what are the character traits that I associate with Midwestern stereotypes? But it's kind of like, reasonable, courteous, like those kinds of things. So yeah, I'm like, where that goes with socialism, I don't know. But like, I also feel like maybe this is because I went to graduate school with like the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. I met a ton of people from Ohio, and they were all, there was like, I don't know, it's a swing state, right? So you got like, you've got like a lot of really like pro public education liberals and people that are a little left of that all over the place there. Did you encounter those folks? Were your parents some of those folks?
Well, yeah, my parents, my dad is actually a Lutheran pastor, and I was born in Toledo, Ohio, because that was where his first church was. And my mom is a paraprofessional in a public school. And so, they're very progressive people, both of them. And and I should say the theology that I grew up with in the church is one that is a very progressive one. No, certainly not socialist or Marxist or anything, but one that sort of believed in the basic tenets of social justice. And, my dad was a kind of a community organizer type pastor who organized around things like housing in a really poor neighborhood where I was born in Toledo. And so, yeah, that general sense is something that I definitely grew up with. And, there is a very strong tradition, maybe the strongest, you could say, of class struggle and even of socialism in the Midwest.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
The founding of the UAW in Flint, the history of industrial unionism, basically, right? Like in meatpacking, in auto and steel plants and all kinds of things. The general strikes of 1934, right? There were 3 general strikes that happened in 1934.
Yeah.
One happened in Toledo, Ohio. The other happened in Minneapolis. So, there is the long history of that doesn't square with our tendency to be very nice, conflict-averse people. But these are the two poles of my existence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing the like world that like Michael Moore tries to portray in Roger and Me, which
right.
you talk about being radicalized at 15. Like I had like a hippie high school teacher that showed us Roger and Me, and I was out here in Southern California, and that whole world you're describing of like industrial unionism and the kind of like, I don't know, populist spirit about things like economic justice was totally foreign to me. And I was like, wow, the people in the Midwest are really doing it out there. So,
but I would say, just in response though to the rest of your question, I mean, like, there's that piece of me,
right.
But then there also is this really like core, belief about, I mean, I don't want to sound like a naif here, but like just niceness to other people and like reasonableness and like love of one's neighbor and stuff like that. Like I that's very important to sort of how I live my life. You could call me sort of Midwestern for better or for worse, or for better and for worse. Maybe.
I find that affect and attitude very appealing, Micah. I think more people should be that way. I don't know. I lived in New York for a long time. I was really into like the hard edge of New York for a while, but that got exhausting. Especially as I got older, it got exhausting to just like hate everything all the time.
Well, I go to New York and it's exhilarating to see this level of like palpable conflict like all around me at all times.
Oh yeah,
I'm like, wow, I definitely didn't grow up with this. Like, why are these people yelling on the subway about like having onions on their sandwich or something? Like, if you're speaking in that voice in my hometown, like that means like you're in an actual fist fight with someone.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So what did it for you? Like you said, you were like you've been a radical since you were a teenager. What was it? Was it like a one thing, or did you fall in with the wrong crowd, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, probably the wrong crowd. I mean, like I said, my parents are both very progressive,
right.
But I got into explicitly radical politics as a teenager through the punk scene in West Michigan, where I spent the second half of my childhood, and like the DIY punk scene in West Michigan, reading Noam Chomsky. I became a vegan. We were into dumpster diving and, people hopping trains and stuff like that. And that whole subculture has somewhat of a strong strain of, like I said, reading somebody like Chomsky or
totally.
Reading Emma Goldman or whatever. whatever. So I actually got into left politics. I remember it was through Crime Think. I don't know if you're familiar with Crime Think.
No.
It was sort of like anti. They're not quite anti-civilization, but there's a sort of like anti. They're about alternative lifestyle. So dropping out of the capitalist system and creating alternatives that way.
Yep.
So that was the first.
Was that a website or like pamphlets you were finding, or what? Where was Crime Think?
Well, I remember the first time I encountered them. They used to produce this sticker that was designed to go on the handle of public telephones, which obviously hardly exist anymore. But it said, "This phone is tapped."
Yeah,
and it had a whole thing about what's it called, the Patriot Act, I think. State surveillance under the Bush era. So this is when I was a teenager. So in the sort of mid 2000s, I think. And they published books, they published zines, and I used to sell their books and zines as well as stuff from like AK Press and some other places at punk shows in West Michigan. And that was I guess that was in a way my intro to left publishing. Not that I was publishing things myself, but that I was selling books and zines at punk shows. That was some of the start of it.
Yeah, I feel like the punk thing has been like so important for a lot of people on this show that I talk about. Like their radicalization started for like going to punk shows and then like seeing something or just becoming part of that world. But it sounds kind of anarchist. That's what the world sounds like, right?
Oh yeah, totally. I definitely identified as anarchist through my teenage years and into college. I eventually fell away from it, but yeah, that was what I identified as.
Yeah, I mean, me too. And like, I'm still getting over it. And like, they kind of like, I don't know. It's like there's an anger. And I asked someone the other day. I'm trying to like figure that out. Like, I always try to figure out like what drives people to the left, and what gets them there. And to me, like, it's either like you either really hate rich people or you really love poor people, like one or the other. To me, like a lot of my early stuff is just being like hating rich people, hating capitalists, and wanting to see them like suffer and punished. And that's where like all the guillotine stuff comes from, in part, right? Like that symbolism. Right. But then there's also this other like impulse that's like, no, the point of all the hating capitalists is like because they're enslaving people, and like we want to like help the people and the mass of people. But what were you, and when you were in that angry anarchist punk stage, like what was driving your kind of like anarchy? Why were you going further, I guess, than your parents in being progressive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I fully have an answer to it. I mean, I did not feel driven by anger in the same way that a lot of people who were in the punk scene were. Like, I'm from I'm from West Michigan, and West Michigan is, the home of Betsy DeVos and the Van Andels and like a very conservative area. And a lot of people who I grew up with they became punks because of their anger at their parents and anger at the church that they grew up in and all this stuff. And that was never the case for me. I never had any anger towards my parents. So I don't really know what it was besides just a really strong sense that the world was a very messed up place, and that it would require a really radical change to be made in order for it to become even decently hospitable to the majority of the population. Yeah. And it definitely came from my dad's brand of Christianity too. I mean, like that.
Sure.
He wasn't preaching the dictatorship of the proletariat from the pulpit on Sundays, but like he was putting forward a vision of the world in which everyone is taken care of and everyone has their needs met. He tended to focus more on like love of the immediate neighbor in your immediate life.
Right. Right.
But it wasn't a leap at all to go from what he was talking about religiously to the political system. I mean, the political system that I've always wanted to see brought into the world always felt like an extension of what he was talking about. So,
right, yeah.
So yeah, and it changed later in my life when I went to college and I got sort of disillusioned with the punk scene. I was involved in like anti-war activism again. This was like during the Bush years.
Okay, yeah.
So,
where were you going to school? Where did you go to college?
I went to college for a year and a half at a small liberal arts school in West Michigan called Aquinas.
Uh-huh.
I did not want to leave West Michigan. I had a girlfriend in West Michigan, and I was dumpster diving and hopping trains and stuff. And so I thought I didn't want to go. So I was like, I'm not going to go to college. And my parents like begging me to please go to college. I went back and forth for forever. And finally, I was like, okay, I'll just go to this college that's 45 minutes away from home, and I'll be able to be with my girlfriend, and I'll be able to continue being a part of the anti-war and organizing that I had been a part of. And so I stayed there for a year and a half, and it was a sort of extra kind of overtime period of my high school years. Like, it was the time at which I kind of fell out with the punk scene and started to realize that maybe that was inadequate for what I wanted to do with my life in a lot of ways. But also, like, I ended up deciding that I needed to actually strike out from home and create a new life, a whole new life for myself. And so I after a year and a half, I transferred to Loyola in Chicago. And I've been in Chicago, with the exception of the last year that I was in Canada, for the last 10 and a half years.
Okay, so that it seems like in that moment where your parents are asking you to go to college, I mean, it seems very, very familiar to me. Like this kind of like, I don't know, you're an anarchist. You don't envision a future, like, right. And like, was that you? Did you envision, like, did you have careers in mind, ideas of what you might do with yourself, or are you just like, I'm hopping trains and in the anti-war movement and that's it?
Well, I do have a very vivid memory of being in my parents' basement arguing with my dad and saying, he was like, so what are you going to do if you don't go to college? And I was like, I'm going to hop trains. And he's like, what? But, I know I didn't have much of a vision at all. I mean, I associated school with my high school years, which I hated. I got decent grades in school, but I was just sort of coasting through it. And I remember reading stuff like Noam Chomsky and thinking like, I read the stuff that's worth reading on my own time. Like nobody's going to hand me Neoliberalism by Chomsky to read in school. Like I just got to do that on my own. And then, of course, when they did convince me to go to college, and I actually went, it was a totally different experience, and I liked it a lot. But I couldn't imagine what that would look like as a teenager, what the rest of my life would look like.
That sounds like the intersection of anarchism and libertarianism, that idea that, like, you don't need school, man. Like, you can just go get you with a library card and just educate yourself. And like that, and those guys always end up reading the same books, like the same 5 books. Those are the Jordan Peterson guys. Oh God.
But there is that sense, you're right, that like this libertarian is sort of like, don't tread on me sense, which I've come to reject very strongly in life, right?
Yeah, right.
Like that was what that whole lifestyle was about, was like nobody should be telling me what I should be doing in my life. But then later in life, I realized like, actually it's a good thing when people tell me what to do, because I don't know what the fuck I'm doing in my life.
Oh,
like,
totally.
I appreciate other people like weighing in, people who might have a little more expertise than me on a certain thing, weighing in on what I should be doing.
Please tread on me. Please tell, please tell me what to do. Yeah, no, it's weird. I never thought about that kind of irony before. That like I was totally like you in the sense that I was like, fuck school, I'm not going there. That's where they like brainwash you or whatever. But then like at a certain age, I like joined a PhD program to go study American history, and I was like, please give me lists of books to read and like tell me what papers to write. Like that structure really helped me grow a lot, and like my kind of I don't know, my skepticism about it was ill-founded.
Yeah, and I've and as time went on, I came to realize that was a huge part of what my dad had talked about in church his whole life, is like, it was like the importance of this, being a part of this, of an institution, that, the institution obviously needs to have room for you to have individual freedoms and ask questions and push back against things and all of that stuff. But like being in the institution, provides you with a certain amount of freedom, actually. Like submitting to some of the dictates of the institution gives you freedom in a way that you normally wouldn't associate the word freedom with. Like we usually think of freedom as just totally no constraints on you whatsoever, but like being a part of what he would call a generous orthodoxy can lead to your life going in all kinds of better directions than you ever would have been able to do just if you were out on the world, out in the world on your own.
Totally.
I don't know if that makes sense, but like, you know, I that has been something that has been really important to me for forever, is sort of like getting, you know, as I said, individual freedom and individual ability to achieve is important, but like being a part of some collective thing that you know, that puts some limits on you and has expectations of you and makes you do some stuff that's good for you, that makes you take your medicine,
makes you clean your room.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I know, and you know that impulse can range, you know, all over the place. You know,
yes, exactly.
All the way to like really stupid authoritative shit or whatever. But but yeah, the kind of like, when I think back to like the aimlessness of my kind of anarchist feelings, what I felt generally was powerlessness. Like when I think back to being like that kind of, I don't know, reading. I don't know if it was, what'd you say it was called? Crime Think. Yeah. I don't know if it was that I saw, but like I had some pamphlets that were about like cars and like the Holocaust of cars and like what cars represented. And you talk about like the anti-civilizational thing. And thinking about that all the time, and like when I was like in my early 20s, I think back to myself then, and I just felt like I just felt powerless, and at the same, I don't think I was necessarily wrong philosophically to think like all these things are like, you know, important things to think about, but at the same time, I think a lot of young people especially can fall into this like nihilism, and that can lead them all sorts of ugly directions.
Totally. The powerlessness is what leads you to decide that we need to burn the whole thing down.
Yep.
I mean, that's what, you know, that's a huge part of why Donald Trump was elected, right? Is people feel powerless, and what does Trump represent to them but a kind of giant middle finger to the entire system, that they feel sort of on a gut level that the whole thing needs to be scrapped and start over again.
Right.
And that can go in positive or negative directions. And it ended up obviously going a negative one. But that's what happens when there's not a real alternative on offer. You feel powerless, and you go out in search of whatever can speak to that sense of powerlessness that you have.
That's great. I never thought about it that way, that like the Trump people are like at the core, they're like teenage anarchists. They're like they have like that level of animus combined with that level of kind of not really getting it. And not having a place to put that energy, you know, like, totally. and that's part of what I guess we're talking about with like building institutions for the left, is like, if you feel that way, if you like, it sounds like a movie or like commercial, but like, you know, if you feel this way too, you know, what I'm thinking about is V for Vendetta. Like that's basically what V says when he goes, I don't know if you've seen the movie or like whatever, but like, he basically like says to the people, like, you all agree with me and you know it, and like here's the project. So his project was like blowing it all up, but our project could be something else, you know, like kind of like identifying something that can draw people's sense of meaning out.
Totally. And like, you know, it really is a kind of socialism or barbarism moment, because like we can either offer something to people or somebody like Trump can. And, you know, this is why, I mean, I've come to feel this more strongly than ever in recent years, that like we do have this responsibility, because obviously what is on offer by the Democratic Party, by the tepid centrist liberalism, is just going to continue to play right into the hands of people like Trump. And so like our responsibility is to create an alternative that can actually speak to these very, you know, understandable and real and rational feelings that a huge chunk, if not the majority of the population are feeling right now.
Yeah, and that rational feeling turns into something irrational like Trump, right? Like, and turns into like, you know, just I don't know. And that there's this conversation about civility, and I think it's like part of the whole thing. But like Trump really like breaks the rules in a way that Americans like apparently want to see, like in politics, right? They want to like see, so like in a weird way, he tells the truth, like an emotional truth to them. And I'm like, I'm wondering like how the Democrats do that, like how the Democrats duplicate that feeling, because it's real. Like Ocasio-Cortez, I mean, she's electrifying, and I think we need charismatic figures, but there's also like, I don't know, that like nihilist feeling that Trump fills is so disturbing.
Yeah,
and I don't know if the Democrats can like even go in that direction, or if that's even desirable.
Well, so far it seems that they can't.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about Chicago, because I mean, it seems like Chicago's like a hot spot for a lot of like what's happening in the country right now. and you've been there during a pretty critical moment. So like I you know a lot more about Chicago politics than I do, and we don't have to go over all of it. But like when you got to Chicago, what were you getting into? Like when you first got there, what did you think you were going to study in college, and how did it lead you to? Because I know you ultimately wrote about the Chicago Teachers Union strike. So how did that happen for you?
Well, I got to Chicago. I remember I got here I transferred in the middle of a school year, and so I got here in January 2007, and it was like the middle of winter, and it was a real lonely time in my life. I like had very few friends for a long time, but ended up finding them through campus activism, sure. And so it was mostly stuff that was focused on campus, and I somehow, despite the fact that I'm not Catholic, ended up going to 2 Catholic schools. And so at both of those schools, things like the annual protest at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia are very important. Talking about U.S. intervention in Central America, it's the history of things like Nicaragua and El Salvador. I mean, that became very important for me. And then I ended up getting involved in a union. Throughout my entire undergrad years in both schools, I was involved in United Students Against Sweatshops. And people who don't know USAS, USAS does both international labor solidarity, like with garment workers who are making collegiate apparel, your T-shirts or sweatshirts or whatever that have your university emblazoned on them, as well as union campaigns on campus. So that was kind of my intro to the labor movement, if you don't count my mom as being a really strong teachers union leader, which I, in hindsight, I do include, but it wasn't quite as palpable for me at the time.
You have to, honestly. And as we started off talking about how like kind of degraded labor politics have been in this country for so long that like just talking to people on this show, talking to lefties, like so many of them are like they credit like having a parent or an uncle or anyone, like anyone who could like explain or model what a union was and why it's important. No, totally. And then my mom totally was the first person who I knew first person I knew who did that. But USAS brought me into the labor movement, and then I got involved with the union my senior year, and that was sort of how I was sort of recruited by a union, and that was my intro to the to unions. The first thing I did after I graduated was I got a job at O'Hare Airport, and organized like a low wage service job at the airport, and organized a union with my coworkers. And it was a very eye-opening experience, working minimum wage, like an hour and 20 minutes away from home, 2 trains and a bus to get to work every day to get on the second shift. And I did it for a year, and it taught me a ton that it sort of like imprinted itself on my soul, I think, in a way. In a way that I think is very useful, and that now that I'm working as a magazine editor, because it was like, I work all in the realm of ideas, but when I was working at this, when I was a service worker, like I could have all these ideas that I want to bring to my coworkers to try to get them to organize a union with me, but like presenting an airtight intellectual case to them about why they should join a union was not what actually got them to move. Right. It was like relationship building and, stuff that was on the much more gut level, that convinced them, that actually we should be acting together to try to change our circumstances at work. So that was a really formative thing for me. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, was that associated with any particular organization? Because I know that, I studied the 60s and 70s, and like the Socialist Workers Party, the SWP, that was like a conscious strategy for them for a long time, was to like have their rank and file members essentially go like join the working class and get jobs places and like organize the working class in these various different, institutions and companies. Were you a part of an organization that was doing that?
Right. It's funny you mentioned that because that is my next book project that I'm working on.
Oh, nice.
One that's on interviewing people of the generation of like the 70s and 60s, 70s, 80s who did industrialization or proletarianization. Or
I know a whole bunch of them,
it.
Micah. So
yeah.
Well, we should talk by email because I know a whole bunch of them, especially the ones that were doing it within the military. But then, they literally joined the military to organize the military from within. But then a lot of those guys and girls went off and worked in mines in West Virginia and things like that after the Vietnam War. So yeah, that's an awesome project. What do you think of that strategy?
I have. Well, there are many thoughts.
I know you probably have a lot of thoughts, and we save them all for the book. But I mean,
yeah. I mean, generally, my thoughts are this. I mean, that historical period is one that's interesting to study. A lot of people made some really heroic life sacrifices to do this stuff.
Totally.
They did it sometimes for very sectarian socialist organizations.
Yep.
And without a particularly great strategy in mind about what they were going to do when they got into the shops. And so I know that there are a lot of people who are very bitter about their experiences, working, dropping out of a PhD program in Berkeley to go work at a steel factory, steel plant in Cleveland or something for the SWP or whatever.
I think there are a lot of dark stories in there for sure.
Yes, there's dark stories, but there's also some really incredible and heroic work. And for people today, for socialists today, I mean, there are fewer and fewer opportunities to even go. What was on offer to people in the past? It was like you could do that PhD program at Berkeley and go get a nice faculty job somewhere, or you could go become a researcher or a staff organizer for a union. Obviously, those opportunities like that are gone.
Yeah.
So people are stuck getting these shitty jobs anyway. They should be, going about their how they're thinking about their political and activist work. And, they should think about what they do at work as that should be part of their calculus about what kind of job or whatever that they should get. I don't think that, having a political party that tells you that, like I said, you need to upend your entire life and go move to some far-flung area to go get black lung in a mine somewhere. That's not a great model. I don't think that people should be doing that. That's a real recipe for burnout or extreme sectarianization. But certainly if you're going to if you're thinking about becoming an educator somehow, maybe you should be a part of a socialist organization that has a strategy for organizing in public education.
Totally.
Same with healthcare or something like that.
Right. Do what you know.
But your original question was about whether I did that as part of a conscious project. And no, I was not in a socialist group of any kind at that point.
Okay.
It was just with the union. So I do think that is a thing that socialist groups should think about today. But in any case, I did that for a year until literally I ran out of money. We did win the union at the airport.
That's awesome.
Which was really incredible.
Yeah.
Yes, and did things there was a day where we all wore buttons to work, and the management freaked out, and they sent a bunch of people home for the day. And so, the organizers called. They're like, "Hey, they just sent everybody home. You got to get to the airport right now. We're gonna confront the manager." And so we all, showed up at work and found the manager in the airport and confronted them in mass. Marched on the boss for real. And the manager had sent so many people home for the day that he had to be running our stores. So he was just stuck in the store doing our work, because there's nobody to do it. And so this guy who I had felt real terror, when I saw him in the hallway or whatever, all of a sudden he had this look of terror on his face. And there's this amazing sort of scene that will forever be etched in my brain of him, literally running away from us in the throughout O'Hare Airport, trying to avoid us confronting him. So I've never really felt that kind of power in my life. Except that moment. That is a moment that really sticks with me. So I learned a ton from that. I'm really glad I did it.
Yeah, that's really energizing, and I feel like, in the small things that have been present at where there are victories like that, even if they're like seem like physical victories against the police retreating or something, there's a kind of incredibly powerful feeling that comes from that, and it needs to be bottled somehow, because that's like that's the feeling you want. I mean, you want to feel like you're winning, and I think that's why the left has been so fractured for so long, is because there's like, we haven't been winning, and there's just like, I don't know, a lot of different ideas about why. But we're in a crisis right now. I mean, it feels like. Do you ever wonder if like things are, I don't know, like our problems seem so urgent. Like when I think about climate change, it just freaks me out, and I'm like. I guess I believe the projections that are on like the cover of the New York Times that like, shit's happening, and it's happening right now instead of like in some far-flung future. How does that fit into your politics? Like the feeling that like we're in a really urgent moment.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is urgent. I mean, climate change is the most obvious thing that is urgent, because we all might burn up soon. But I don't know. I'm of a couple minds about it, I guess. I mean, like, obviously what I said earlier, that I feel that we are in this incredibly, unique moment that may prove fleeting, and we need to accomplish as much as we can in it before that window closes, is true. Mm-hmm. But I also feel like, part of my life was figuring out, my life up to this point, was figuring out what I am good at and what I enjoy and what my contribution to the movement is.
Right.
And, I spent, after I worked at the airport, I spent a couple of years as a staff organizer for a workers center, mm-hmm. organizing car wash workers in Chicago. And I was not very good at that. And, you could say that was what, we need to be organizing this workforce, for example, because they are like one of the most exploited workforces in all of the city of Chicago. And so like, Micah Uetricht, like, get in there, do it. They need an organization right now. So let's go. And I wasn't very good at that.
Why weren't you good at it?
Well, it's
because this is hard work. I mean, I've never done this kind of work, and it sounds really hard to me. And having read about all these guys that were going into the military and other places in the 60s and 70s, and like they were college kids, like they were like college students who felt like they were talking down to these like working class kids, and there was a real like class and cultural barrier between them. Did you experience that, or what was your problem? Why were you such a failure, Micah, at organizing?
Part of it was that, I'm a white dude. I speak Spanish. And so it was an almost monolingual Spanish-speaking workforce. And so at the end of the day, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy would pop out of the bushes and be like, hey,
right.
I heard you guys are getting screwed. Like, you ever think about forming a union? And they're like, who the hell are you?
Right.
So it was like literally the most difficult campaign possible for somebody who's of my demographic profile.
Totally.
But also, it also kind of goes back to the Midwesternness. Like, part of the job of organizing a union is that, like, you go to workers, whether you're coworkers or whether you're a staff organizer and you're going to just a group of workers you're trying to organize, and you say to them, like, you guys are getting screwed. Like, you don't have to be getting screwed. You can come together and you can change things. And because that is such a scary prospect and a foreign prospect, and it has all these risks, like the boss is going to fire you or try to get you deported or whatever, the workers respond with a whole list of excuses of why they don't want to organize, because they're scared and because there are real things at stake. And the job of the kind of workplace militant or the staff organizer is to, like, stomp your foot and be like, no, comrades, like, do you want to live on your knees for the rest of your life?
Yes.
Or do you want to, join together and change your life and change the world? But my response would be like, well, okay, yeah.
You're like, okay,
those
cool.
Those are good reasons. Like, who am I to say? Like, yeah, you could get deported. Like, I don't want to be responsible for you getting deported. Like,
totally. That would scare me. I'd be like, no, you should not get deported. Like, I don't want to be responsible for that. And like, I'm totally like you, and that I would be like really meek about it and run away and be like, no, you guys are good. You should probably just be thankful with what you have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like that was why I was bad at that, and I spent a good chunk of my 20s sort of in a crisis about that, because I'm like, well, this is what the real work, capital R, capital W, real work is, and I'm not very good at that. So what do? And, I had interned as an undergrad at In These Times magazine. I don't even remember how I found it. I just sort of stumbled into it. Mm-hmm. And I had kept writing for them, off and on for a couple of years. And I saw it as a hobby for a while. It's just like, it's this kind of petty bourgeois thing that I do on my free time or whatever while I'm not doing the real work. But then my trajectory is that I met Bhaskar Sankara, who founded Jacobin, and he needed he needed a web editor, and I had written something about the Chicago teachers strike when it happened for Jacobin, and he needed a web editor to be like literally the only person who got paid anything at the magazine, because Bhaskar ran the magazine from his desk as like a receptionist at CUNY. And so he was not getting any money from it. I think we paid somebody to bag up the magazines, when they came out quarterly. But he needed somebody who would work for basically half-time wages for full-time hours. And I was like 24. And so, Obamacare had passed, so I could be on my parents' health insurance. Mm-hmm. And so I did that. And after a couple of years of that, I worked for a year at Jacobin. And then for the second time, when I ran out of money, I had to get a job that would actually pay me a salary. And so I started working at In These Times. And it was at In These Times where this is a long way of getting to my point of the story, which is that at In These Times, I felt for the first time during the mayoral election in 2015, the aldermanic, the city council races in the mayoral election, that like, I'm actually good at this and I'm making an important contribution to the left. Yeah. Like, there is no like real work. There, we all have roles to play, and my role is like I'm actually I'm an okay writer, but I'm actually a pretty good editor, and I can play an important role. Like during that election, there were things like a union endorsed Rahm Emanuel, Unite Here Local 1 endorsed Rahm Emanuel. So I ran a bunch of stories that were like this progressive, quote unquote progressive union. Just endorsed this neoliberal monster, Rahm Emanuel, for mayor. And so, like, I, ran a bunch of stories like this, and this sort of caught on. People read the stories and were like, "Oh my gosh, like this is horrible. Unite Here is really screwed up here." Or like we turned the magazine into a place where people from the labor movement and from community organizing could, parse the lessons of that election, and we could bring people together for public events where they could talk about those things. And like, this is what a magazine is uniquely suited to do. And I'm like, I can actually bring these people together. I'm pretty good at it. And so that was how that's the long-winded answer of how I went from just banging my head against the wall as an organizer who wasn't very good into accepting that I'm an editor his vocation, I guess, in the Christian terms, is editing.
That's great. That was a very cinematic image to me, though. It was like you kind of tapping away at a typewriter and having a this like moment of realization where you're like, my God, what if this is the real work?
It's a Saul on the road to Damascus moment to continue the biblical image.
Totally. So melodramatic, Jesus. But no, I see your work everywhere, and I really appreciate it. And like, I think that what you and Jacobin are doing are part of the matrix. It's like part of the kind of like multi-leveled attack that's happening at Capitol right now, and it must be. I mean, it's exhilarating to be a part of it, any part of it.
Yeah, it's totally exhilarating, and I honestly do not think of myself as somehow more important in playing a more important role in that matrix than the people who are who are organizers or who get elected to the steering committee in Boise, Idaho for DSA. Like we're all playing this really critical role in the left, and like I see. I mean, I do think my role is important, but I don't think it's like more important
No, of course not. I mean, I host a podcast. I mean, I can't really make it. But I mean,
but the podcast is part of the matrix.
It is part of it.
Like,
yeah, no, I feel like media work is totally part of it and getting ideas out there. And I wouldn't do it if I didn't think it was important. But you're right. At the same time, I'll watch like some like, Vice magazine documentary about some people like fighting for clean water in their town, and I'll see like some, representatives that are fighting for it, and I'm like, I'm a total piece of shit. These people are actually on the ground, like putting their bodies on the line, and like that's part of like the horror. And when I talk about urgency, like we're in like this, people like us are in this kind of like really privileged position to be able to like kind of even like watch all of this stuff happen on our phones and computers, and see like, I don't know, people are drowning in the Mediterranean right now, and like all that stuff just adds a kind of, I don't know, it's always there to me. Like it's always in the background, and it's always what the fire is kind of about.
But in the case of what you're talking about, I mean, yes, it's totally true. Like when I'm unshowered in my house at 2 p.m. like in my underwear editing a Jacobin article, I'm like, am I really like contributing that much to the movement?
Yeah.
But
are you Vladimir Lenin here?
Exactly. But then I hear from somebody like Lee Carter, for example, that guy who's a DSA member who won elections to the state legislature in Virginia. Like in an interview, he said that Jacobin was really important to him coming around to socialist ideas, right? Yeah. And so it's like, I'm not more important than what Lee Carter is doing, but I am helping play a role to like produce Lee Carters. And I'm sure there's people who listen to your podcast who get ideas from what they hear on here, and they take those ideas and they run with them. So
I hope so, and that's the point. And just like writing a Jacobin article or editing a Jacobin article or putting out a podcast, I mean, you don't know where that stuff is going to be consumed and what it's going to do. But at the same time, something's working. Like something's working out there, and it's really cool. And it's a really cool feeling to be like, I don't know, like that's what solidarity is, I guess, is like that feeling that like there's something happening that we, whoever that might be, can be a part of in one way or the other. And I know it's going to be a weird, amorphous, like strange revolution. But thanks for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm glad to be on the show. I'm a first time, long time. I've been listening to a show for a long time. Nice. It's a great, and there's really, just to give you a little plug here, I mean, there's really nothing like your show that's out there that does these kinds of interviews with people like, everyone from people on Left Media to like, I remember listening to your Eric Foner episode.
Oh yeah, that was an early one.
Your Nelson Lichtenstein episode recently. He's great. I mean, yeah, there's nobody else who's doing this, so I'm very appreciative to you for putting this kind of stuff
Thanks,
out there.
Micah. I appreciate it, and we are going to continue with the Nostalgia Trap as much as we can. So I appreciate your those words. Okay, I want to thank my guest, Micah Uetricht. I had a great time talking with him. Always makes me think of the kind of the possibilities of electoral politics. I'm kind of a curmudgeon about that stuff, I know, as I've been on the show. But it's great to listen to that point of view, and I hope you enjoyed that. Again, you can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff at thebaffler.com, at nostalgiatrap.com, and if you want to subscribe and get even more of our points of view and extra interviews and stuff like that, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and subscribe to the show. Thanks, as always, for listening, and we'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.